Hi everyone, welcome to Athletic Skills Podcast, and today I've got Jonty Norris on with me. So Jonty, thank you very much for joining. So Jonty is S&C coach at British Triathlon, but also had background in professional football, cricket, rugby league, to name a few. So Jonty, thank you very much.
No, thanks very much for having me on. I appreciate the invitation.
So Jonty, you've had quite a bit of experience across different sports, especially in doing some lecturing as well. So how did you fall into the passion of strength and conditioning in terms of a career?
Yeah, I was at Loughborough University for my undergrad degree, and so whilst I was there, that's when I got into strength and conditioning as something that I wanted to do. I suppose the main reason for it, and the story that I tell people, is that I was at a talk, a regulation kind of careers talk from an S&C coach called Dave Cripps, who I know plenty of people will know, I'm sure. And he was talking about his work at the time at Leicester Tigers and what he was doing. And it just triggered something within me, if you like, around problem solving for athletes, trying to find solutions to what they would need, performance problems, day to day towards aligned goals or these big outcomes that people wanted to achieve. And it was a kind of a combination of all those things that really got me into it in the first place. And it was one of those where I immediately, on the back of it, I was like, what do I now need to do? What information do I need to go from where I am in my undergrad degree to taking this on seriously as a profession? And it was one of those where, yeah, immediately, can I get an internship somewhere? Can I start to get experience? Can I do all these things that I would need to set me off on the path? And just simple things like then it was, can I now select appropriate modules? So I was still doing my undergrad degree at the time. It's, can I now select modules that are most appropriate for this? So things around training principles, physiology, things that would be useful. And that set me off really. And I was lucky in some ways to get some opportunities, but at the same time also just worked a lot, volunteered a lot, just provided coaching for a variety of people and took it from there.
So how did you navigate? You mentioned around trying to make those first steps in terms of understanding where I should go in terms of internships, placements. So how did you maybe start to find or navigate finding those first sort of opportunities to get into the industry?
Yeah, so my kind of first role was to tap into the career stuff from the university. And then on the back of that, I would say that this kind of level of information there is today around different podcasts or mentorships or the different information that gets posted on social media probably wasn't quite the same level back then. But what became really clear was there's a need to gain valuable or relevant experience in the thing that you want to try and do. As I say, like that was a bit of support from the careers department. And then on the back of that, it was a case of, can I now apply for anything that would be going? So some internships and roles will obviously be advertised, and so you can apply for that. But the other side of it was, can I just go and try to learn from people? So I was really lucky to be at Loughborough, where there was a lot going on from a sports performance point of view. And so one of my first kind of port of calls was to go and just work shadow some of the coaches there that worked with the student athletes at the time. And so I managed to just have a couple of days here and there, like a couple of afternoons. And then leading on from that, it went into, can I just do some voluntary stuff? So do I just go and I went and just started taking some warm-ups for some of the football teams, because the kind of top teams would get support. But then if you're in the third, fourth, fifth team or whatever it would be at Loughborough, you haven't got anyone doing anything for you. So I just went along and said, I'm happy to help, like in whatever way, like I'll just take a warm up, I'll just take a session, whatever you need me to do, and just build up from there, really.
And I think a lot of students, they obviously have that aspiration of maybe working in elite sport, and they initially think, oh, I'm going to contact those elite environments to try and get an opportunity there. But like you just mentioned, coaching a fourth and fifth team, maybe at a university or a grassroots level, yeah, I would be going to get a bit more value from coaching those experiences. So how did you go around making the most of those opportunities in terms of placements and internships so you actually develop rather than just maybe shadowing or standing at the side?
Yeah. The big thing that I would say is just trying to always take something from it. So always try and like actually leave knowing more than what I did at the start, which sounds like a bit of an obvious thing, but it's actually being active in that process rather than passive. Like I say, it's easy to go on a work shadow day and you can just stand there and you can just watch and you can do whatever. Or you can go on those days and you can ask questions, contribute in some way, even potentially going as far as just adding value, adding an opinion and in the right way. And that's what I would try to do without taking up someone's time too much or without kind of getting in the way, if you like. But actually trying to be really proactive in the way that I would communicate with the coaches or the players and just try to be a positive energy in that environment and then take it from there. And after the first few and after a couple of internships and things like that, then I think it is about trying to add value. And as much as even when you're early career, it's like, what can you actually add value in? But there's still definitely things you can offer, even if that is purely just your time or just your opinion. Like just try and actually give something of yourself to what you're doing. Show that you're really willing to help and to listen and to learn and get that ball rolling and hopefully from there you can push on.
And from now, also, you can see at the other end in terms of you're quite established in the industry. But also, you can see from a student perspective, having done it yourself. What are your thoughts in terms of volunteering for free or working for free in the industry in terms of you think that's the right thing to do for a student? Because there's that debate, isn't there, around should people work for free to get into the industry?
Yeah, and I think there's a little caveat, like a lot of, I suppose you can always say it depends, but I think it depends on certain things. I think if you're going to go to an established club or team or whatever it might be, and you're going to fulfill some job requirements that you're going to take on a role, then I do feel like there should be some level of remuneration for that if you take on a level of responsibility. If it's the situation where, as I was, and you're just trying to gain some experience at the fifth team of a football club, or you're just going to be coaching some friends or your own team. A lot of people participate in their own sport and they can gain some experience doing that. Those aren't roles where you're not going to be paid for that. And I think there has to be some level of acceptance. That might be something that you have to do. I don't think, maybe not everyone does have to do that, but I think at a certain time and place, I think it is valuable. And it probably isn't going to be forever. And something that I'll say when I speak to students, if I'm lecturing, is that whilst you're studying is the ideal time, because you're ultimately there to be a student and to do your degree and to do those things. But if you can give 1 or 2 hours a week, which isn't a whole heap of time, to just developing yourself a little bit as a coach, that will be massive by the time you finish your undergraduate degree, because you're already 1 year to a year and a half maybe ahead of your peers. And if that means that you have to go and work for free for a year and a half whilst you're studying, I think that's acceptable. What I don't think is acceptable is if you're being expected to do 10 hours a week at a championship football club and do that for free. I think that's a different thing that you're talking about.
And we often think around the monetary value or the monetary outcome of a role, but the outcome in terms of it's hard to put a number on in terms of experiences, learning off a mentor if you've got someone really good to work with for free. And if you think around how much you might pay for an expert mentor to have a one-to-one session with them, whereas you could be maybe volunteering with them for free for an hour a session, that's a really good value you're going to get in terms of your career long term rather than a wage perhaps in terms of that hour.
Yeah, absolutely. And there is a lot of value you gain from that work. And like I say, I think there is a line. I wouldn't like to say exactly maybe where that line is drawn as to what becomes unacceptable and acceptable for that. But I definitely think there's a time and a place for volunteering your time. And there's a time and a place for when you should be appropriately paid for what you're being asked to do. And I think a lot of the work that the UKCA have done and other bodies have done, I think is important. But like I said, I don't think we can get to a place where you just would totally rule out ever working as a volunteer, because I just don't think there's enough opportunity for people to gain experience like that at the very early stages.
And I had one student ask me the other day around, it was a question around fear and doubt. So obviously it was quite a hard industry to get into. So did you have any moments in terms of your career, whether that's at the start or whether that's as you starting to establish into a role in terms of fear and doubt that you might not make it?
Yeah, I would say definitely, and I wouldn't say only at the start either. I think probably throughout different phases at different times, where you think, is this the right thing to be doing? Is this right for me? Can I actually make a career out of this for the long term. And I don't think that's unusual. I would say a lot of coaches that I speak to or spend time with, I think will go through that. We'll go through thinking about what it is that you're doing, because I think you mentioned at the start, but about what's your passion, what got you into it, and why. And I think if you don't have that in this industry, I think it can be really difficult, and you've got to really want to do it and really want to love it, because as much as it can be a really rewarding, really satisfying, and a really fun thing to do, there's also periods where it'll be really challenging. And so I think I would be surprised if there's anyone that's working as a strength and conditioning coach anywhere that hasn't probably had a period of time in their career where they've questioned what they're doing and why they're doing it.
And like you mentioned, there's ups and downs, actually getting into role, but actually ups and downs within the role. Because as you probably know, working in football, you're in times where your job might be under threat. Or if a new manager comes in and brings in new staff, or if you're around a relegation point and the pressure's quite on. So yeah, there's a lot of challenges there in terms of the role that you've got to try and manage. And that's just part of the industry.
Yeah. Yeah, you're absolutely right, and that's definitely something from football, particularly, and for anyone that thinks about football or wants to work in football. But your level of job security is maybe not what you would get in other industries. You have to be mindful of that, and I think that's probably what is promoting this kind of more recent push for people to diversify in their income streams. I think that's important, and I think that's a good thing for strength and conditioning coaches. And it doesn't surprise me that more and more people will do that, because it is probably as important if you're going to be in and around environments where, as I say, the security maybe isn't what it could be.
So now I just want to move on to a little bit around actually within you getting a role now. So how did you navigate around applying for jobs, trying to differ yourself from other people to get those roles? And that probably applies now you're applying for head roles, or you've got head roles as well. How can you maybe start to navigate making yourself different to others when everyone's done the UKCA now, everyone's got a degree? So what other areas can you maybe differentiate yourself?
Yeah, I would say, sorry, at the time when I was really trying to push into my first roles, big thing that I wanted to try and do was just combine my practical and academic experience. I was really keen to gain more from a research point of view. As I say, like, part of the reason for why I wanted to get into strength and conditioning was this sort of solving of puzzles to do, and research really lends itself to that. And so, yeah, when I was early in my career, I was faced with a decision about going into employment, and that would have been like a graduate S&C coach role at a private school, or I was given an opportunity to go and study a PhD full time and then essentially coach part time alongside it. And so at that point, I did have to weigh that up and decide what I wanted to do. And I said, because I was really keen on the research side of it, I really wanted to try and do that and broaden my opportunities, if you like, by having an extra strand. So being really good at those research type activities, whether that be just basic critical thinking or having a better understanding of statistical analyses or whatever it might be, and dig into some of the specific topics that my PhD would have looked at, which was at the outset was meant to be kind of looking into the use of GPS in rugby league and some factors that would influence fatigue and recovery. So really relevant as an S&C coach. And so what I thought was I can get a really good understanding of some of these areas that I'm interested in and have that as an additional sort of strength, if you like, or something that I can use in my career and in my CV to move on afterwards and move into another sport. The other point I would just make about that is that prior to that, I'd been working in cricket. And so I was really keen to expand out of cricket and go into another sport and just start that journey of multi-sport, getting experiences in different environments. And so the PhD was giving me an opportunity to move into rugby league, people who I didn't know, work in a sport I didn't know, go somewhere else in the country that I didn't know, expose myself to all of these different things that I hoped at the time and that in hindsight did help, would elevate me as a candidate for roles.
And I want to go into around the value of being a multi-sport practitioner in terms of, you mentioned a lot around the theory there in terms of advancing your knowledge that way, but was there any value in terms of the softer skills, maybe in terms of like how you communicate, how do you man under pressure, or networking in terms of people knowing of you within the industry to then get you into a job?
Yeah, without a shadow of a doubt, I think a big part of that multi-sport again, which we'll come on to, but is going into new environments, communicating with different people who come from different backgrounds. Cricket is, in some ways, in this country, it's still quite an upper class kind of sport, especially the top end, because the vast majority of male players coming through will go to private school, and that leads to a certain type of education and a certain type of upbringing. To then go and work in rugby league, where all the lads are coming from predominantly working class backgrounds in poorer parts of the country, and going into roles where they're actually still having to essentially study full time potentially, or work full time or part time alongside their sport, is a totally different thing. So how you go about communicating and coaching with those individuals is totally different, and that was something that I wanted to get better at. And like you said, the other part is, can I now branch out into another sport, make connections with people, network with different people in a whole different environment, that come the end of my PhD and at a time where I want to go back and be a full-time coach again, hopefully that will give me the avenue to either go in cricket, where I have been, or possibly even into rugby league. And at that time, because I was teaching as well, it gave me the avenue that I could actually go and lecture on the back of that. So it was always in my mind to try and diversify as much as I possibly could.
And going into that multi-sport benefits as a coach, and you mentioned some really good ones there. But how did that help you in terms of your delivery, whether that's as an SC coach providing some exercise in the gym or on the field, some movement-based exercise? Was there a lot of transfer there that you could take from different sports?
Yeah, I think there's always a lot of transfer from a general point of view, which is really useful. There's a certain base level where no matter what sport you're in, you can sort of apply some of your key principles as a strength and conditioning coach to that sport. The thing that I really enjoy about moving between sports is getting into the more specific training, and finding out what are those nuances from sport to sport that people are doing, whether that be things such as weekly periodization, or is it exercise selection, or is it anything around loading strategies, whatever it might be. There's sort of different things because the priorities are different. And so I moving from cricket into rugby league, when you could say from a highly technical sport into what is a highly physical sport, again, was something that I really wanted to do, to experience that. Because the bread and butter stuff, trying to get people stronger in a general way, is really similar, and that's fine, that's okay. But actually, to go from a sport like an 80-minute, primarily one game a week sport, or go into that, sorry, from a highly varied sport like cricket, where it could be anything, it does mean that you actually specialize in some really different ways, and you have some different priorities, and they're the bits that you then learn and you can then take forward into, say, other sports when you move on later on.
And I can remember when I was working within cricket, I think I spent a couple of days at a tennis academy, and I saw a lot of value there in terms of how they're coaching their players to move laterally or accel, decel, and there's some little nuances there that I managed to take into cricket, into fielding, because a lot of transfer there. So that's a value I took away from just even spending a day. It doesn't necessarily mean you need a career in another sport if you're really into your cricket or into football, but if you can expose yourself to a day or 2 days or half a day in another sport, I think you're going to get a lot of value from that as well.
Yeah, I think you're completely right. And I think, like I said, for me, it's always about the things that you can then take and apply in either in the future or at the time, like with what you're doing. And that's the most important thing for me, to always be trying to get better as a coach, as an S&C coach. What can I learn and what can I take from these environments to better serve the players and athletes that I then have in front of me at the time? And some of that stuff, some of the stuff that I've learned from cricket, where you have to try and train in challenging situations, challenging schedules. Like, how can you actually improve people when the fixture schedule is as difficult as it is? That was extremely valuable coming into football and dealing with congestion, for example, here. And you go, what can you do? And it's actually, I know, because I've experienced it and seen it, that it's really possible to train in those type of situations. But that was a learning from cricket that I could bring into the football environment.
And I often talk to coaches around the value of multiple for the players as well. I haven't really spoke around for the coach, but for the players, it's a really good one, I think, in terms of their movement and their opportunity to learn. So, like within cricket, again, I'm taking my players to maybe an afternoon at gymnastics where we learn how to roll and dive, or again, tennis, we learn how to move laterally, or boxing, how to move our feet in a good way in terms of that could transfer to batting. So there's a lot of benefits there taking your players to another environment as well.
Yeah, you did. And I say we in the sense of Sunderland Football Club when I say that, but we've been big fans of doing exactly that in the sense of can we expose players to a variety of different movement and sensory stimuli, if you like, particularly with our rehab players, but even with the fully fit senior players, actually, can we get them out of their normal patterns from time to time with whatever that might look like. But yeah, as I said, with our rehab players particularly, we have a real strong emphasis on that. Can we actually get down and say play racket sports is a big one for us. I know you mentioned tennis, but yeah, can we go play badminton with them? Can we go play paddle now? That's becoming super popular. And these things where you can get them moving in kind of more natural ways without always having to just be in a gym environment or in a really sterile place.
And it's good fun as well, especially if
Yeah,
you're training 5 days a week. And you mentioned the rehab players there, who it can be a dark time for them, so it's good fun.
yeah, absolutely, and it's something that I do think is really important is that enjoyment element of training. I would say that in probably all of this, every sport that you go to, there's an element of it where to be at the top level, it's quite mundane. It can be quite mentally demanding, and you just do the same things repeatedly day after day, and that's because that's what it takes, and ultimately that is what it is. But if we can find ways as coaches to add that enjoyment element into sessions, then I think you're always going to get better buy-in from players from that point of view, and you're probably going to get better adaptation on the back of that as well. It is something that I think is our job as coaches to make sure that's happening within those sessions.
So now I want to move to maybe transition to a head role. So you've been head of SSC at Derbyshire Cricket and Sunderland. So how did you transition, or how did you manage to navigate those roles in terms of moving from just a normal coach to head of department? And was there any differences there from the start of your journey?
Yeah, I would say the biggest change is taking some time away from what you would call the basics of S&C, if you like. So your programming and your delivery, and moving into that kind of development or like mentorship, developmental role for other members of staff. That's probably the biggest bit. And it's something that I actually really enjoy. And something, one of the reasons why I've pushed more into those head type roles is because I actually get quite a lot out of that in the same way that I enjoy coaching athletes and seeing athletes improve. It's seeing practitioners improve and helping them with that. But like I said, the biggest challenge and the biggest change is that rather than being able to be 100% focused on athlete performance, it's okay, it's taking a little step back, being a little bit more strategic in the delivery, and taking some time out for other people to help them with how they're going to go about their delivery. And I think for some people that maybe comes naturally, and for some people it maybe doesn't. So I think for some people it would work would prefer to stay in a delivery focused role, and I totally get that. And it's not for everyone. And I think the only kind of shame, if you like, or pity in the industry is that in order to progress, it feels like you have to do that. Whereas I think there should be a lot more value placed on really excellent coaches continuing to be really excellent coaches, and then being paid appropriately for that at whatever level that might be, particularly around youth development. I think people who are really good youth development coaches, unfortunately, probably don't stay in those roles for very long because they end up wanting to go and get paid more and go into senior roles and do other things. And I think that's a real shame on what happens. I'm talking a lot about football clubs there, really, in my mind, but I think a real big progress for us as S&C coaches and the S&C community would be, can we more appropriately look after people who are excellent at what they do in and around youth athlete development?
And just going off the back of that, and I was thinking about this the other day, was the classic pathway for coaches to do that. Maybe the pathways are in the 30s and the 14s. Then as they progress, they'll move to academy, then senior role, senior teams, then head of departments. Whereas we need to put, which means the youth athletes will have the more inexperienced coaches, but arguably those youth athletes need more experienced coaches because that's a key time for their development, or need specialist coaches within that area. It's weird how that sort of industry, how the industry sort of pathway goes around that transition from youth to then senior.
Yeah, you're dead right, and I think it is strange. And it, as I say, it's something that I think is a real limitation of our industry probably at the moment, in that how it works like that. And I think some people are going to want to go and work with senior athletes and at the highest level, and that's totally fine. But I know personally a number of coaches whose preference is youth development, and they'll speak to me about it, and that they feel like they can't do that forever because they're limited in what their salary is going to be. And so unfortunately, they then end up moving into other roles that they maybe aren't as well suited to. And I've seen some really brilliant coaches with the younger athletes, particularly, who have then gone, actually, I can't really do this anymore. I'm going to have to go do something else because I can't afford to just stay on this salary. I hope that does change in the future. I think I need to be in a slightly higher position to be able to force through some more of that change. But if I get that opportunity in the future, that's definitely on my agenda to try and make that change.
And before we go into a bit around your PhD and around athlete monitoring, which I know is one of your passions, but if we talk about evidence-based practice as a whole, in terms of you've had background as a lecturer and working in university as well, but how do you manage to fit in gold standard or evidence-based practice into context? So not all the theory might work in every environment. So how do you start to go around adapting some of the learnings that you get into your context?
Yeah, I would say my strategy around that and trying to apply theory and practice has always been that kind of traditional plan, do, review type of process with things. So it might be whatever example that you take from say, a training protocol or whatever it would be. Let's try an element of that or whatever that might be within our structure. So how is that going to fit in our structure? Let's plan that and put that in place. And then ultimately, let's do it and review it appropriately down the line. It's something, again, like just to flip back to what we're talking about in my head roles, it's something that I've tried to encourage other practitioners within the club to do the same way. Just to give you an example of something we're doing right now is just looking at how pre-training preparation in football, like what is the actual influence of that on performance? So it's become this big thing, but really there's not a whole heap of information on it. Does it actually benefit us in any way? So we're trying to take that at the moment, and it's a good example of where you go, okay, let's take some research like potentiation or priming session for want of another term that you could look at. Okay, how does that fit for us? And then can we actually implement that, but then review that? And if we're getting something positive from it, then brilliant. Then let's use that. We can refine it. Let's keep going with it. If we get nothing from it, then let's park it or potentially adapt it in a different way and try and move forward, because ultimately our job is to improve athlete player performance. If we're doing that, brilliant. If we're not doing that, we need to have a look at ourselves and work out what we can do better. And so that's how I've worked across a whole heap of different things. Like I say, from training protocols to, yeah, we can come on and talk about monitoring in a moment, but even monitoring things like that, where let's try something, let's identify a period of time, let's put it in place, but then let's make sure like we review that appropriately and then move on from there.
And that's good bit of advice I need for the students or people coming out of university into a role, and I'm sure they've got lots of ideas of maybe theories or some complex training methods that they might have learned through university, and they feel like I should put all these learnings into practice straight away. Or so I think it's about understanding the context you're in, the individual you're going to work with, and what can you get biggest bang for buck as well. Especially if you're not at the elite environment and you only maybe see your athletes once or twice a week, what can I do that's going to get the biggest bang for buck in terms of my training methods? So I think it's understanding the individual, and that'll come with experience, I guess, won't it, over time.
Yeah, definitely. And like I say, I think I just mentioned there that improving athlete performance is the primary aim. But that's, you could consider that in the gym. So you're improving performance in the gym, but ultimately that actually doesn't matter either. It's the athlete performance in their sport. And so that's the thing that we've always got to keep like laser focused on. Are they doing what they need to do in whatever sport it might be that you're working in? And is that improving? Because it's nice, like we can strength train for 10 weeks and someone gets stronger and that's brilliant. But if it's not actually had a measurable or an observable impact on their actual sport performance, then it's not really that relevant. Like it helps in some ways and depending on who we're talking about, but ultimately we've got to keep that in mind. And like I say, that's where that kind of reviewing process comes in, because you can then constantly be thinking, did that work? Have we moved performance forwards or not? And then do we need to adapt that or not? And has that say, shiny toy or whatever it is, that shiny idea, has that actually been useful or not? And doing that process constantly just leads to really good development, I think, for individuals. And that's how over time you hopefully refine your methods and you get better at being a coach.
So moving into like athlete monitoring, which is one of your key topics that you like to work on in terms of your practice, and I know your PhD topic was around use of GPS and objective markers in terms of fatigue monitoring. So firstly, why should I start to monitor my athletes in terms of if I was a coach?
Talking about there is that we have to have an element of evaluation of the program and what we're administering and understanding how the athlete is responding to that. So that for me, like from a monitoring point of view, could be you can call it whatever you want, you can do whatever you want with that, as long as you have some way of collating some kind of information on what we've been doing at this period of time. Has that done what we wanted it to do? Or has it been successful? Has there been any negative consequences? And where are we at now? That's why I think we have to be doing it. We're not doing it, then we have no idea whether we're improving them, making them worse, or doing nothing. Like, or we might as well just not be here for the sake of what they're doing. And I think a lot of people will say, like, assess, not guess is always the thing, isn't it? But I don't really like that as a phrase particularly, but I think the actual idea of it is correct. Like, we need to actually understand what's going on as opposed to just you're going day to day and we have no idea what's happening.
And I think a common trap that coaches might fall into when they want to go into athlete monitoring is they'll try and monitor everything. So they might try and monitor every single metric, whether that's objective or subjective. How do you maybe start to go around building some sort of athlete monitoring system, keeping it simple, making sure, and this probably applies in physical profiling as well, making sure you actually use the data rather than just not collecting it for need's sake?
Yeah, absolutely. And I would say the way that I start out, and your final point there is critical for me, is that how do you use it? So the way I would start out is with only a small number of things, even only one thing, and make sure we're actually actioning what we're doing, because there's nothing worse for players, I would say, than them having to do something where they feel like there's no purpose or no action taken from that. And so whatever, in the first instance, it has to be actionable. So being really clear on the process of that. So if I take this information, what is the outcome that I want to see from that? So that can be, I just want to see whether someone's adapting to the program. That's perfect. If that's your outcome, that's great. You can then feed that back appropriately to the players, the coaches, and everybody else, and we'll use that. If it's something different, then you've got to look at that in a different way. But in the very first instance, it's like, what is the outcome thing that I'm wanting to influence? Okay, let's put this maybe small thing in place so that we can make that outcome happen, and then build from there.
I think another key consideration is once you start to build your monitoring system is how do you start to get buy-in from the players and the coaches, because they're the ones that are going to be actually impacted on you monitoring them. So maybe you're asking them to do a jump in the day or you're asking them to fill out questions every day. So how do you start to get their buy-in in terms of to do this and actually get proper data? Otherwise, if they're going through it half-heartedly or if they're not giving true information, then there's no point in actually doing the monitoring.
My main thing with that would always be like providing good, timely feedback. So that whatever it is you're doing, say it's a jump, like just provide feedback on that jump. Like your score on that day, what is that score compared to what your normal score is? Is it better? Is it worse? Is it whatever? Is there then going to be a change in what you're doing based on that? Giving all that information, because if someone just comes, does a jump, walks off, and then there's no kind of feedback to it, they don't know why they're doing it, what they're doing it for. And then that's when I think you do get that level of or lack of buy-in and going through the motions and not really getting anything valuable from it. So the first point of call would always be that, just provide as much feedback as quickly as possible. Now that can be really challenging to do, and I do appreciate that. But again, that's why I would say start with something that is achievable and like small in the first place to make sure that you can do it really well. And then you can always build up from there. And like I said, once you get that feedback and you're having good conversations around what you're doing, why you're doing it, and what those outcomes are for the individual, then you tend to, for the most part, get good responses and good buy-in, I would say, from players.
So going into like in your study, in your PhD around monitoring fatigue. So what were your key outcomes in terms of that study? What are the better sort of metrics you might look at or better monitoring systems it might look if I was going to pick and choose and I didn't have any restriction in terms of money or time?
Yeah, I would say one of the big things that I took away from it was that we can, if we have a really big battery of monitoring tests or things that we're going to go through, what will often happen is multiple streams of that will change simultaneously. So what I mean by that is, say, like post game, someone will report the soreness subjectively. They'll probably, if you're doing a jump, not jump quite as high. If you're doing any kind of blood tests of any description, they'll be worse. You're basically doing all of this stuff that's all going to just tell you the same thing. So what I would say is then you could, in some ways, just come right back. So you go, we know that if the blood, we know after a game, bloods are bad, jumps are bad, but they're also going to tell us they're sore. We could take all that away and just ask them how sore they are. And that would take much less time and give us something that tracks really closely with those more complicated markers anyway. And that was a big eye opener for me, because by the time I got to that point, I was probably 4 or 5 years into the process of researching different types of monitoring and things like that. And even, I would say even to this day, like jump monitoring is a massive thing. People will talk about that a lot, and it's valuable. It's absolutely valuable. But what should never be cast to aside is just what people's perceptions are. And if you can get good, honest information on subjective responses, that's probably the most important piece of information that you can take. But alongside that, do you say the other kind of key bits that I found is that need to be quite specific around like the task or like the monitoring task based on what the sport task would be. So what I mean by that is if the demands of the sport are high running loads, for example, say whatever that sport might be, but you're doing a lot of running, say something like I do now, triathlon, the running volumes can be hundreds of kilometers a week. In order to monitor that, we need an objective test that is sensitive to running volume. And that might sound like obvious, but it's easier said than done. So if we're going to select a jump, for example, like what kind of jump test is most sensitive to running volume? And what that might end up being that something more elastic in nature, so something more like hop jumps, like reactive strength, something like that might be more useful than like a counter movement jump, for example. But I'm just trying to make sure that you match that up. And where I got to with that was, part of my study was looking at the influence of physical contact on your recovery in rugby players. And what was really interesting is that if you have no physical contact and it's like a pure running kind of demand, and you have your repeat sprints and your repeat efforts and things, that kind of fatigue profile is different to if you have all that running and you have a load of physical contact as well. And what would tend to happen is like the actual running kind of loads and your running intensity would be lower, but then your actual fatigue responses or what you would get from some of these markers will be higher. And that's purely coming from that physical contact. So it's really important then to match that up, because the external load doesn't look very high, but actually the cost on the player is much, much higher. And so matching all those things up is maybe where it's a little more challenging, and that like process needs to take place where you try things out and you try and observe what the influence is of, say, the training load or the match or whatever it is that's going on with your athletes.
And is that having a good balance in terms of subjective measures and the objective measures and then pairing them together? And what happens in terms of if the subjective a player tells you they're feeling fresh and but maybe their objective markers aren't as high as they are on their normal, or the other way around, if the player's saying they're really tired but they're still jumping as high, for example. So how do you go around that process as well?
Yeah, so in an applied setting, if you like, so away from what my research was, but how I would implement this sort of day to day is that the monitoring itself, subjectively and objectively, just provides a flag, if you like. It's a point of information for us to take note about something. So, for example, in what you're saying there is if someone says they're good, but objectively they're poor, that's a flag for us to just investigate that a little bit further, even if it's vice versa. So if objectively really good and subjectively poor, we can investigate it further. What I would never do and never look to do is just be pure data, like the data says this, therefore this is going to happen. Or what I would actually always do is have that kind of next phase approach of where we go. We actually just need to investigate this more before a decision is made, because it could be it could be down to anything. Like we've got to appreciate that if someone is just objectively down on a test, is that actually us? Have we got our protocols right? We have to be aware of that. It can be a whole host of things. It could be that they were actually in a rush because they came in 1 minute before they had to get to a meeting. And so what they did was they didn't do it properly. They just did one rep of something. They were cold and it was really poor, and then they just ran off. And so actually that's not a particularly valid data point. So we have to understand that, and we can't just make decisions just based on cold, hard numbers sometimes.
Before I go into a few questions that people have asked around etymology, I just want to go through one scenario that I'm sure you've considered, that you've gone through and I've gone through as well, in terms you might make a recommendation to a coach or to a player that they're tired, they're fatigued, they might need to do less in training today, or you might even go through a discussion of being left out of the game on Saturday. But if a coach maybe disagrees with that, or a player disagrees with that, how do you go around that process? Because I'm sure many coaches out there would have had that scenario.
Yeah, of course. And many times have I gone through that myself. And I think that my main sort of learning or finding from that is that what's critical in those situations is the relationship that you have with those people prior to that, which is maybe a bit of a cop-out answer. But what I mean is that if you have established trust with some of these individuals ahead of time, like just around your role, then you can have honest and open conversations around where you're at. If that is about someone maybe not being able to perform on the weekend, maybe needing to be left out or managed, then you can have that conversation from a place of trust and honesty. And then generally it's more well received. And I would say in the majority of the relationships that I've had, you can get to that place and ultimately have a sound discussion about something and come to some kind of conclusion. And that's not always going to be what you necessarily think is best, because there's a whole heap of environmental and contextual factors that'll go into it. And often we can't hang our hats on 100%. This is the thing that we have to do. Sometimes we're always playing with the balance of probabilities. So someone is a little bit fatigued on the morning, the day before a game. We've got probably 36 hours until that game happens. Can we now just be really proactive and put things in place in that period of time to just get them in as good a state as they can possibly be for Saturday afternoon at 3:00? And that's really important, and we have to accept that. And I think as S&C coaches, performance coaches, like I say, we don't know with 100% certainty that any kind of, like, a player might get injured if they just go and train up late. And so we have to accept that and just have, as I say, open, honest discussions about what we think is the appropriate thing to do.
And I think your key quote there that you mentioned before was around not just letting the data make decisions, actually understand the individual, not just completely rely on that kind of jump or whatever measure you're taking. So making sure you put other things into context. Just to go quick finish on this topic, some quick fire questions that people have asked you around athlete monitoring, especially because now you're working in British Triathlon, and with that being an individual sport, and you've had a lot of experience working in team sport. So what considerations would you do in terms of when working with an individual compared to a team environment?
I would say that the biggest change for me is more around understanding the training schedules for those people, because they are different. You work in a team sport and you have the team training plan, if you like, and you know what's happening with each person on any given day. It follows that pattern, and that's never too far away. But with the individual sports, it could be totally different, because they're on different race schedules, they're on different training programs depending on what their outcomes are. So at any given time that we might be trying to monitor someone, we have to have a bigger appreciation of the context around the individual. And that's what I would say has been the biggest sort of change for that. The other part I would say that comes from triathlon is that there's large periods where we're actually probably expecting them to be tired, because they're going through high training loads for certain reasons, and that's acceptable. So again, like saying, oh, this score is low, that's what we would expect to happen. That is the anticipated response, and we're okay with that. Now we have to understand what too low might be, and at a point where we actually need to pull back and help. But it's a bit of an appreciation that this is going to happen, this is where they're at, compared to, say, football, where for the majority of the year, we're looking for them to try and be as fresh as we can make them for Saturday. Now, that's, again, not always possible with congestion, but we want their scores to be good, in a good spot the majority of the time, because we've probably only got 3 or 4 days until the next game. So we're never going through that process of overreaching an individual at any time.
And a lot of the stuff we spoke around there around the athlete monitoring is more from, I'd say, more for the elite stuff or the adults. Or would any of your actual monitoring change for adolescents or youth athletes in terms of monitoring their training load, especially if they're playing multi-sports? There's different coaches involved in terms of their priority. So yeah, how would you maybe start to go around monitoring your youth athletes?
Yeah, with my youth athlete stuff, it's far less objective, and that's predominantly kind of budget related, if you like, because of what's available. And so it's far more subjective, if you like. It's incredibly difficult because of the variety of activities that the kids are doing between PE, their sport, other sports, whatever it might be. It's an incredibly challenging thing to do. But I would come back to what I mentioned just earlier about having strong relationships with coaches, and sometimes when it comes to youth, with parents, and actually being able to discuss things with them. That it's not uncommon for me in my work with swimmers to have some of the kids be completely exhausted in sessions because they've trained in the pool twice, they've been at school all day and done PE, and then they've come to the gym for a session, and you just think this isn't appropriate for you today. And again, because I'm always trying to build and maintain those relationships for a good level, puts me in a place where I can hopefully say, look, this isn't the right thing for you today. You might also need to think about what you do tomorrow. Just try and get a little bit more rest and go from there. And that's a purely subjective thing that we'll try and do.
And then my final question to finish off is if you were giving advice to a sports coach, because I'm sure there's a lot of them listening to you, might not have the budget to invest in GPS jumping things. So someone that have very, very basic resources, how would you maybe start to monitor my grassroots or youth athletes I'm working with, might see once a week or twice a week? How would you maybe start to monitor those?
Yeah, like I say, I would try and do something subjectively with them, and it sounds maybe quite clinical and quite cold in what we're saying here, but that can be quite simple in you just what's your energy like in the session. And there's some quite nice things I've seen people do more recently with like emoji scales and things like that. And I think for youth development stuff, I think that's really good. And what I would say though is something that I mentioned previous. Then, what is your outcome going to be? What is your desired outcome? If you want to get started with monitoring, what do you want to get out of that? Is it because you want to, or you're going to modify training based on the response to that? And if you are, then brilliant, you can crack on and do that. If you're never going to modify training based, no matter what someone says to you, then there's probably not a whole heap of point in doing the monitoring in the first place. You might as well just get on with training and use your time doing something else. So I would just have that in mind. What is it? Why are you doing it? What are you doing it for? Be really clear with that, and then think about what you can put in place. But I would say there's a lot of value in subjective perceptions of, say, fatigue or energy or whatever it might be. And if you want to get started with some and modifying training based on monitoring responses, that would be my go-to place in the first instance.
And just to finish up on that, on your point of mention around subjective stuff, so that could be a scale, that could be an RPE, it could be an emoji scale, as you there. But as long as you're consistent in terms of the scale you're using, I presume that would be okay in terms of in practice.
Yeah, absolutely. So just be super consistent with it. As long as it's the same scale that you're always using, try not to change from doing a 1 to 10 scale to suddenly doing a 20-point scale, or going from a 1 to 10 to an emoji or whatever it might be. Like, just try and be super consistent. As I mentioned earlier, just almost make a decision on something and run with it for a period of time. So say you take a 1 to 10 scale of energy and you want to try and modify training, try that for a period of 8 to 12 weeks, whatever it might be, and decide whether it added value to your program and your training group or not. And then if it didn't, then maybe try something else, or reflect on that and alter it. Or if it did work and you got the outcome desired, then brilliant, you can crack on it, and maybe you can add something else because you've learned something along the way and thought, oh, actually, it might be useful to do this as well. It might be something else. That's what I would say, is just give things a try. Don't be too scared of just getting going with something and seeing how it is, and then review it later on.
So, Jonty, thank you very much for coming to chat with us, and it's been great chatting with you. There's been lots of great points there. So if anyone's got any questions on your actual journey, your experience, or anything on the athlete monitoring side, is there any way that people can get in touch with you?
Yeah, I'm on. I was gonna say I'm on Twitter, which is not called Twitter anymore. That might give it away a bit, but it's probably the easiest way because it's like a public forum and it's easy to find me on there. I think I'm just Jonty Norris on that as well, and I'm not super active on it, but because I'm in different roles at the moment, so email's not particularly useful. But yes, you can find me up on there, and feel free to message me or reach out in any way.
Perfect. Thank you very much, Jonty, for chatting, and appreciate your time. And yeah, thank you very much for joining.
Nah, thanks a lot, Isaac. Appreciate it.
Thank you so much for tuning into this episode of the Athletic Skills Podcast. I hope you enjoyed our discussion and found it helpful in learning more about impacting your youth athletes' movement and physical development. If you did enjoy this episode, please take a moment to give us a subscribe and share to any other coaches or teachers that you think it may help. Also, if you have any feedback or topics that you'd like us to cover in future episodes, please feel free to reach out to us on social media or on the email in the description. And we'll be more than happy to try and tackle those challenges you are facing as a sports coach or a PE teacher. Thank you very much, guys, for listening. I look forward to speaking to you soon.